I didn't cry when my sister-in-law mocked my broken shoes at the dinner table. I didn't flinch when my husband chuckled along with her. I just looked down at those scuffed heels and smiled quietly. What they didn't know was I was already weeks into buying out her husband's collapsing firm under a different name. And tonight, the same woman who once asked if I collected trash for a living would soon be applying for a job at my company. She laughed at my shoes, but I built an empire with the same steps they stepped on. The clink of silverware and soft hum of conversation barely masked the tension thickening around the dinner table. I could feel Vanessa's eyes on me before she spoke. She always aimed for the silence before her punchlines. It gave her cruelty space to echo. "Darling," she said, her wine glass poised like a weapon, "is that suede, or did you wrestle a raccoon for those shoes?" The table burst into polite, stifled laughter. My husband coughed into his napkin, not quite laughing, not quite defending. My mother-in-law gave a tight-lipped smile as if she was too gracious to approve, but too pleased not to enjoy it. I didn't look up. I didn't give Vanessa the satisfaction. I just shifted slightly in my chair, letting the candlelight catch the scuffed toes of the old shoes. "Vintage," I said softly without emotion. "They tell a story." "Oh, I'm sure they do." Vanessa smirked, flicking her hair back. "Probably involves a Goodwill clearance bin." I reached for my glass of water with steady fingers. No one asked me why I wore them. No one asked or if I was okay. That was the difference between family and blood. They knew how to wound you where no one could see and smile while doing it. But what they didn't know, what they never even bothered to wonder, was that the worn leather on my feet was the least valuable thing I brought to that table. I left dinner early, using a headache as my excuse. My husband didn't protest. He stayed, of course. There was wine left. There was still room for Vanessa to gloat. Back in my apartment, I placed my purse gently on the kitchen counter. I slid out the tiny device sewn behind the zipper and connected it to my laptop. The video loaded, clear audio, crisp footage. I watched myself, small and silent, framed by their laughter. I watched Vanessa tilt her head, her lip curl. I zoomed in on my husband's face. He looked amused, even relaxed. He didn't look married to the woman they were mocking. I saved the file, created a new folder, labeled it Evidence. Then I opened another tab, searched domain availability. My fingers moved quickly, no hesitation, no second guessing. The name had lived in my mind since the first time I thought of vengeance, not as emotion, but as precision. Veilcapital.com. Available. Purchased. And just like that, the first brick slid into place. They didn't know my history because I never offered it. They assumed I was some lucky girl with a pretty face who married into money and settled for mediocrity. They didn't know that 4 years ago I was running financial risk models for one of Silicon Valley's rising unicorns. They didn't know I was one of the architects behind a billion-dollar valuation. They didn't know how it felt when your best friend liquidated your trust, pinned the blame on you, and left you to face the storm. They didn't know because I didn't let them. And this time, I wasn't going to lose everything because I trusted the wrong person. This time, I wasn't going to cry on hardwood floors or beg banks to reverse overdraft fees. This time, I would weaponize silence. I closed the browser and stared at the screen for a long moment. My reflection stared back, faint in the black glass. I looked ordinary. The kind of woman Vanessa would dismiss in a boutique, the kind of woman people don't expect to take control of boardrooms. Perfect. I opened a private spreadsheet and began entering names, startups with high burn rates, firms with risky venture patterns, shell companies with liquidity problems. I had no intention of humiliating Vanessa with words. That would be a waste of power. My revenge would not be loud. It would be a transaction, and it had already begun. In the weeks that followed, I lived 2 lives. By day, I played the role of the quiet wife, grocery shopping in linen pants, making banana bread, smiling in group texts with Vanessa about spa discounts. but by night, my world sharpened into lines of code, spreadsheets, data visualizations, and anonymous Zoom calls with people who didn't care what shoes I wore, only what I knew. Veil Capital became more than a shell. It became a mirror, one I angled toward the world to expose what others tried to hide. Through encrypted platforms, I reached out to dormant venture funds and angel investors, groups who had money but no risk appetite. I offered them a different lens, one filtered through real-time behavioral analysis of leadership toxicity. They didn't know the source, they didn't ask. They just saw the numbers, the risk-to-impact ratio, the psychological modeling, and they came. I didn't mention Vanessa. I didn't need to. The camera footage gave me weeks' worth of material, micro-expressions, passive-aggressive phrasing, deliberate exclusion tactics. I fed the data through a sentiment engine I'd written back when I still believed people could be saved with enough insight. I called the output Human Risk Profiles. Vanessa's score spiked red in every category: narcissistic bias, hierarchy addiction, threat escalation. But she was just the prototype. I built the tool for more than revenge. I built it to flag leaders like her, long before they poisoned their companies from the inside out. I wanted investors to stop betting on charisma and start measuring damage. And I needed a test subject. Rick was perfect. The husband Vanessa flaunted like a trophy was, in reality, a man addicted to short-term wins and digital bravado. His fintech company, Vardis, looked sleek on the outside. Buzzwords, pitch decks, crypto jargon. But underneath, it was duct tape and ego. I hired 2 analysts through a dark network of freelance operatives who specialized in corporate ghosting, embedding themselves in companies under vague consulting titles and quietly pulling the financial threads loose. They cost a fortune. They were worth every cent. Within 10 days, they uncovered a disaster. Rick had diverted company funds into pump-and-dump coin schemes, hyped through influencer shills and Telegram groups. The SEC hadn't noticed yet, but the hole was growing. Vardis was bleeding, Rick was spinning, and the market had no idea. I watched one of the operatives upload footage from a private meeting. Rick was sweating through his blazer, mumbling about reframing the narrative. Vanessa sat beside him, her eyes pinched tight, her arms crossed like she could hold the company together through posture alone. I paused the video, zoomed in. She still wore the same necklace she'd worn at that dinner. That detail pleased me more than it should have. I spent the next few days crafting an offer. Veil Capital would approach Vardis not as a savior, but as a partner. A small injection of capital in exchange for long-term equity, a voting seat on the board, and unrestricted access to internal financials. Enough to stabilize Rick's panic, but not enough for him to feel replaced. I worked the language carefully, soft enough to soothe, sharp enough to cut later. The email went out at 2:17 a.m. I watched it disappear into the void, then stared at the inbox, waiting. The reply came 5 hours later. He wanted to talk. The meeting was set for that Friday. It would be virtual. Rick had no idea who he was meeting. He thought Veil Capital was a West Coast syndicate run by ex-Google types. He'd Googled the fake bios I'd planted. He thought he was in control. I wore a voice modulator during the call, pitched to neutral, and let my operative do most of the talking. I watched Rick lean forward, desperate, oily with charm. He lied about numbers I already knew were false. He called himself visionary. I muted the feed and laughed. When the call ended, I walked to my closet. I pulled out the shoes. The same ones Vanessa mocked. I set them on the floor in front of me. "You built your castle on sand," I whispered. "I built mine on memory." By Monday, the deal was signed. Veil Capital had become Vardis's lifeline, and I had become the shadow owner of everything they were about to lose. Rick looked like a man reborn. He started wearing suits again, expensive ones. Vanessa posted brunch photos on Instagram with cryptic captions like, "The grind pays off." They hosted a cocktail evening at their condo, complete with a jazz trio and a tower of macarons. The guest list included people they hadn't invited in years, because now they had something to prove. Vail Capital's investment had reinvigorated Rick's confidence, like a hit of dopamine. He thought he'd pulled off a miracle. I let him. Each funding round was small enough to feel unthreatening, large enough to matter. With every injection, Vail Capital gained a sliver more control. Clauses buried in legal jargon, rights of oversight tucked into terms he never read. I hired a legal team that specialized in making power look like support. They played their part beautifully. At home, I baked lemon scones. Every Tuesday, I attended a local baking workshop with other stay-at-home wives. I wore pastel sweaters and asked questions about yeast. I laughed when someone said sourdough was a personality trait. I was perfect wallpaper. Vanessa even commented once that it was nice I'd found a hobby that suited my speed. She had no idea I was building a war machine. Behind the scenes, Vail Capital's leverage grew. I called it the silent throttle. By the third round of funding, Rick no longer had the right to bring in new investors without approval. By the fourth, we could access company financials in real time. By the fifth, we could call for a vote on leadership structure. I waited. Rick had no idea he'd handed over the keys to his own house. And Vanessa, so smug in her designer jumpsuits, had no idea the woman she mocked for wearing broken shoes now signed the checks that paid for her hair extensions. The final board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Rick expected another quarterly review. Instead, he was greeted with a surprise motion from Vail Capital's legal rep, a vote to restructure executive leadership. He blinked at the document, then laughed. "This is a mistake," he said. Our rep shook his head. Per Clause 4.3 under the Series E agreement, Vail Capital holds 63% voting power on matters of executive reappointment. Vanessa, seated beside him, paled. "You can't just remove him." "We can," our lawyer said, calm, "and we are." Rick stood up so fast his chair scraped. "This is absurd. You wouldn't have a company to restructure without me." I watched the live stream from my home office, sound muted, eyes steady. Rick's face reddened, his voice cracked. Vanessa reached for his arm, but he shrugged her off. The lawyer handed over a single-page document announcing the new interim CEO. The name printed in bold, Ezra Blake. I smiled. Ezra had been a junior developer at my old startup, the one that collapsed after my partner embezzled the core funding. When I lost everything, Ezra messaged me a single line: "You don't deserve this." I never forgot. Last year, I helped him secure funding for his new project, a stealth cybersecurity venture with no public affiliations. I told him he'd only owe me one favor. Today, he was collecting. Rick slammed his fist on the table. Vanessa grabbed a water glass and flung it across the room. It shattered against the wall, tiny diamonds of fury raining down. Ezra remained still, unfazed. Vardis will be stabilized, salaries will continue, but there will be changes. "Who the hell are you?" Rick barked. Ezra looked directly into the camera. "Someone who doesn't underestimate quiet women." The feed cut. I sat back in my chair and closed the laptop. There were no fireworks, no headlines, just a quiet shift in power, a subtle tilt in gravity. Vanessa didn't say anything publicly. She didn't call, didn't text. But that night at exactly 9:23 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You mocked my shoes. I now own your roof." I stared at it for a full minute before deleting it. She didn't need to know it was from me. She already knew. The invitation came in a black envelope with gold lettering and a wax seal, just theatrical enough to appeal to Vanessa's idea of elegance. It was for a charity gala hosted by the city's most photogenic elite, raising funds for a children's STEM initiative. Rick was no longer invited to speak, but Vanessa would still attend. She was on the board, after all. Appearances mattered. I RSVP'd with a check that quadrupled the next highest donation. The night of the gala, I stepped out of the black car in a dress that stopped the cameras. Fire-red silk clung to me like a second skin, every stitch hand-sewn by a designer whose waiting list was measured in years. But it wasn't the dress that caught the attention of the crowd. It was the shoes. Scuffed, worn, with a split seam near the heel, they were unmistakably damaged. But paired with couture, they became a statement. The fashion bloggers whispered, intrigued. Was it irony? Commentary? Distressed luxury? They nodded approvingly. They called it brave. I walked past the velvet rope, head high, and entered the ballroom. It took Vanessa 10 full seconds to recognize me. Her jaw slackened, wine glass tilting slightly in her hand. My mother-in-law, seated beside her in a gown 2 seasons out of date, froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. My husband, my technically still husband, stood at the back of the room, pale beneath his designer stubble. I gave them all the same smile, polite, unreadable, distant. Then I disappeared into the crowd. The gala was a spectacle. Chandeliers like galaxies, violins echoing through the marble, donors in every shade of arrogance. I spoke with tech founders, nonprofit execs, a senator's wife. I gave no indication that this evening was anything more than a fundraiser. But when the lights dimmed for the scheduled presentation, I took the stage. The MC announced a short video prepared by a new sponsor, Vail Capital. Gasps rippled through the room. People turned to look at me. I nodded once. The screen flickered on. There I was, sitting at the dinner table months ago, silent, small, surrounded by laughter that cut like glass. Vanessa's voice rang out clearly. Did you wrestle a raccoon for those shoes? The chuckles, the smug faces, the complete disregard for my presence as a human being. No commentary, no edits, just raw, documented cruelty. When the video ended, the room was still. Then someone clapped, then another, then an explosion of applause that echoed off crystal and marble. People stood. Phones were already out. A few whispered, brave, unbelievable, disgusting. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to point fingers. The message was already loud. This, I said into the mic, wasn't about me. This is about how we let status excuse behavior, how cruelty hides behind designer logos and dinner parties. This is about the women who sit through humiliation because it's safer than confrontation, about the ones who record the pain not to shame, but to prove they weren't imagining it. The applause grew louder. I left the stage before it died down. I didn't need to bask in it. The truth had already scorched everything I wanted it to. Vanessa fled the event before dessert. Reporters hounded her the next morning. The video went viral. Twitter renamed her the sister-in-law from hell. Talk shows debated her smile, her tone, her upbringing. Old classmates came forward with stories of bullying. Former colleagues shared tales of sabotage. My mother-in-law posted a photo of herself with a quote about choosing kindness, the caption suspiciously devoid of mention of Vanessa. My husband emailed me 2 lines. I didn't know it had gone that far. I'm sorry. I didn't reply. Within 72 hours, I was labeled the quiet comeback queen by 3 separate media outlets. They wrote think pieces about power, silence, and the art of revenge. I was invited to speak at women's conferences, write a memoir, join advisory boards. I said no to most of it. I didn't want to become a symbol, but symbols are rarely chosen. They're forged. On the 5th day after the gala, my phone rang. The voice was smooth, practiced, familiar in the way only entertainment executives can be. I'm calling on behalf of Netflix, he said. We'd like to talk about the rights to your story. I stared at my reflection in the window. The city behind me sparkled with the same oblivious confidence it always had. I haven't finished the story yet, I said. That's fine, he replied. We like stories that are still becoming. Fame doesn't arrive with fanfare. It seeps into your life like spilled wine, slow, sticky, staining things you didn't mean to touch. At first it was flattering. An editor at Vogue wanted to feature my red dress. A university invited me to speak on emotional resilience. Book agents sent flowers, but then came the strangers, waiting outside yoga studios, snapping photos at the grocery store, whispering my name like it belonged to a brand, not a person. People started treating me like an idea. That was when the email came. Subject, "Let's talk. One last time." From Alyssa Grange. It took me a full minute to recognize the name. When I did, my mouth went dry. She hadn't written in 6 years, not since the day I found out she'd funneled company money into her personal accounts, pinned the blame on me, and walked away clean while I stood in courtrooms explaining balance sheets to men who already believed I was guilty. Now, apparently, she was a podcast celebrity. Her show, Truth Tellers, had blown up after she exposed a VC scandal involving sexual coercion and misused funds. The irony tasted like rust. She wrote, "You have every right to ignore me, but I want to make this right. Come on my show. Let's talk about everything. I'll let you speak first." I stared at the screen. The old rage stirred, sharp, familiar. But beneath it was something worse. Curiosity. Not about her story, about mine. What would it sound like? Spoken aloud. I didn't reply that day, or the next. But on the third morning, I found myself hovering outside her studio in Lower Manhattan, staring at the blinking neon sign that read, "Live recording in session." Inside, I saw her silhouette through the glass. Hair sleeker, voice calmer, posture practiced. She looked like someone who'd been praised for her pain, monetized it. I walked away, but I didn't delete the invitation. 2 nights later, I lay awake in bed, the city buzzing below. I kept replaying the moment I'd stood on that gala stage, letting the world applaud my control. I had won. I had stripped my enemies of their comfort. I had redefined the power dynamic. But now, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pride, just a kind of numbness that made success taste hollow. I had spent years becoming the opposite of the woman who once cried in a frozen yogurt shop bathroom after reading headlines that said she'd ruined a company. I had become sharp, strategic, impeccable. And somewhere in that transformation, I had blurred the line between reclaiming power and replicating cruelty. I wondered if Vanessa ever felt this. The weight of public shame, the fear that one misstep would become a meme, a headline, a hashtag. I didn't pity her, but I didn't feel triumphant either. What scared me most was how familiar she now felt. The next morning, I stood once more outside Alyssa's studio. A producer met me at the door. "We're honored," he said. "We've blocked an hour. You can end the recording at any time." Inside, the room was dim and padded with soft foam. Alyssa stood when I entered, hands open. "Thank you for coming." I didn't answer. She gestured to the mic. "You want to start?" I sat, adjusted the headphones, took a breath. The red light blinked on. She smiled. "Samantha Linwood, welcome to Truth Tellers. Today's episode is—" "I'm not here to forgive," I said, cutting her off. My voice was steady, cold. She blinked. The producer froze behind the glass. "I'm not here to redeem you," I continued, "or to be healed. I'm here to remember, out loud, so no one gets to rewrite what happened to me. Not you, not them, not even me." Silence hung heavy in the room. Then slowly, I leaned toward the mic. And I told the story, not of the revenge or the viral video or the shoes, but of the girl who trusted, lost, and learned to survive in silence, the one no one had asked about until it was convenient. And for the first time in years, I spoke not for applause, but for truth. The offer came during a storm. Rain clattered against the windows of my apartment, as if the city itself was trying to get in one last word. I was sipping black tea, barefoot, reading a novel I'd been too busy to finish. When the call came, I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was precise. British, moneyed. "We'd like to make a formal acquisition proposal for Vale Capital," he said, "on behalf of the Laurendale Group." I let him talk. The figure he offered was obscene, record-breaking. A valuation so high it would make headlines, not just for the price, but for what Vail Capital had come to represent. I said I'd consider it. Then I hung up and stared at the rain. An hour later, I called back. I said yes. The news broke the next morning. Analysts dissected every angle. A triumph of quiet leadership, they called it, the rise of ethics-driven capital. But I wasn't interested in being anyone's case study anymore. I signed the deal, transferred ownership, and I cashed the check. Then I walked into my lawyer's office and requested a full legal name change. Samantha Linwood became a closed chapter. With the money, I launched the Ash Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping women disentangle themselves from coercive family dynamics, financial abuse, and systemic silencing. We offered legal services, relocation support, seed grants for independence. Our mission wasn't flashy. We didn't go viral, but women came, from all backgrounds, all ages. Some still whispered when they told their stories, like they were afraid their pain wasn't valid unless someone else confirmed it. I knew that silence. I had lived in it, so I built them a place where they could speak without permission. I moved out of the city a few months later. The skyline had become a reflection I no longer needed. I found a small town near the coast, population under 10,000, where no one recognized me at the farmer's market. I rented a white house with blue shutters and planted a garden for the first time in my life. At night, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched the stars without worrying about headlines or hashtags. I didn't miss the noise. One morning, a knock came at the door. A girl stood on the porch, early 20s, nervous posture, clutching a copy of a magazine that featured me back when I was the quiet comeback queen. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "Are you her?" I hesitated, then nodded. She swallowed hard. "I don't want anything. I'm trying to leave someone and I don't know where to start." I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "We'll talk." She didn't cry. She asked questions. She took notes. And when she left, she smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. That was when I realized the story hadn't ended. It had just changed genres. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. The garden bloomed. I spoke less, listened more. And slowly, the weight that had clung to me, victim, villain, avenger, fell away. I was just a woman again, no longer seeking revenge, no longer performing control, just existing, guiding. Sometimes I still wore those shoes, the ones Vanessa had mocked, the ones I wore to the gala, the ones that had become more metaphor than leather. They were nearly unwearable now, but they reminded me, not of pain, but of precision, of what it meant to build something, not to destroy, but to outlast. One afternoon, I found myself writing in a notebook by the window, not strategy, not goals, just thoughts, scattered, soft. A line came to me and I wrote it down slowly, pressing each word like it mattered. I never wanted revenge. I wanted to prove you can burn quietly and rise louder. I closed the notebook and I smiled,